Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Bill Pohlad, John Cusack, and Brian Wilson. Hi, John. How are you? Gentlemen, thank you so much, and congratulations on an extraordinary film. I just gave it 4 stars in the New York Daily News. Bill, tell us how you came to it. Brian's story, we all know bits and pieces of it, but how did you come to put it on film?
Well, people have been trying to make a movie about Brian for a long time. There have been various attempts, and I think one TV movie made. But, a real serious effort was going on for a few years before I saw it. It was a script that came to me called Heroes and Villains. And it was a little different, a more traditional take on it. And so when I read it, I was really interested in the idea, but wanted to change it into a more intimate portrait. And that's kind of what we did with John Wells' company, and developed it from scratch at that point, and this is what it became.
Mm-hmm. Brian, what was the most crucial thing for you in talking with Bill as the project started to go? What were 1 or 2 of the main things that you wanted to get across?
I want to make sure that he casted the portrayals of me, good, so that when we made the movie, people will like the closeness of it.
Yeah. And John, you have the formidable task of playing Brian. One of the things that struck me about your performance is there is a very innocent quality to it, a childlike quality, and yet also the sense of having seen so much. How did you work with Brian on finding just sort of the right note to hit?
Well, I worked with, I met Brian and his wife Melinda, who's sitting right here, who's in the movie. And I worked with Bill and Oren, and they all worked so hard at it with Paul Dano. So the Wilsons were gracious enough to let me come into their life and come to their home, and the dogs were running around and their kids were running around, and to sit with him, because that period of his life is a little less public and less known. In fact, there's a lot of legend and lore about that period of his life. So it was nice to be able to speak to Melinda and Gloria, who works with him, and just say, well, what happened and what was the relationship like with Dr. Landy? And it wasn't maybe the most pleasant part of his life, but they were very gracious to speak openly about it, because even though a biopic, that genre, they try to tell everything. We admitted by the fact that we had 2 actors playing Brian that you can't make a definitive version of anything, but what you can do is make an album or a song that's true to the source. And I always went back to Brian's music and just really dove into his music just to try to figure out what he must have been feeling and what it must have been like for him. But I couldn't have done my part of it, at least without the Wilsons kind of talking to me and letting me feel it.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because the vulnerability that's in your performance and Paul's very much feels of a piece with the music of the Beach Boys, Brian's music, and Pet Sounds in particular.
We sort of hoped that, or Bill's vision of this was that you'd have 2 actors playing Brian, and not trying to do a unified performance, but just coming from our hearts, and hopefully they would harmonize.
Yeah.
And it all came back from the music.
Yeah, and they do. Let's take a look very quickly at one of the scenes here with Paul Dano in it. I mentioned at the start that this film really captures how a masterwork is created. Bill, how did you kind of go about trying to find that spot where inspiration and planning and serendipity all sort of come together to create a masterpiece like that?
Well, again, it's a big responsibility to try to recreate a really seminal period in music and in popular music and in Brian's career. But I guess what I channeled more was some of the early documentaries that I grew up with. Or occasionally you'd see things like, Let It Be or Sympathy for the Devil, that were real kind of inside looks. We didn't really have VH1 behind the music or any of those things back then. So it was really, those were the things I was trying to emulate, real doc-style footage of, where you felt like you were really there. And that's what we tried to do. We hired real musicians instead of actors. We sat them down, dressed them up in period clothes and sat them down, but they really didn't rehearse. Instead, it was like a normal session that they would come in and do. We had Paul kind of steeped in the sound of Brian and how he would work in the studio. And Paul came in with the music and they started working as if it was a real session. It really was a real session. And we had two 16mm cameras shooting, just totally like a doc.
Yeah. And there's a scene with the cellos where he's having the cellos kind of do that is so recognizable. After you see the film, you're going to want to listen to Pet Sounds about 17 times.
And don't forget Smile Sessions.
And Smile Sessions, that's exactly right.
Which
and the Smile Sessions, which
blows your mind
are
every time
equally
you listen
amazing.
to it.
And so but you get a sense. It's almost like you were really there. It does have a documentary feel, but for about 45 minutes to 55 minutes, it is just an extraordinary piece of I compared it to like an Amadeus when you're watching Mozart and Taylor come up with something. It's the same kind of thing. It was filmed in the original studio, correct?
Yeah.
That Brian, where you
Western
filmed it?
Recorders, yeah.
That's amazing. It's still there. You found it deliberately.
Yeah.
In the back, you mentioned that there's an area that looks like 1965.
No, I mean, you walk into the main area and it looks modern. They've redone it. But once you walk into the studios themselves, each one still has that feel. One of the studios Frank Sinatra recorded in, and Brian and all the greats from that era. And then the smallest studio, Studio 3, is the one that Brian recorded most of Pet Sounds in. So you probably got to look there. You would jam these musicians in there. You can't believe how many people he would get in there, as well as dogs and all sorts of things. But this beautiful music came out of it.
Upwards of, I believe, like 25 or 30 musicians or so, right? I mean, it feels like Brian.
About 15.
Wow, about 15.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It felt like 25
Felt
or
like
30
25.
in that
Felt like
room.
25, yeah.
And I'm sure that for everything we see on film, I'm sure there was even probably 2 or 3 levels to the recording that probably couldn't get on film. It was just too. There was just so much going on, right?
Yeah, there were too many instruments playing all together.
Yeah.
Guitars, pianos, basses, horns, violins. Yeah.
Yeah. And a dog. You do bring in the dog.
Yeah,
for a
we
bark.
brought in a dog, yeah.
Yeah, right. I want to bring up the extraordinary performance by Paul Dano as well. And John, did you connect with Paul on how to play Brian at various points? Did you guys ever have a conversation like that?
We didn't. I think it was always Bill's idea that we would do. I said, two different kind of songs about Brian and hope they'd harmonize.
Yeah.
I did find out later that we both used the Smile Sessions as sort of a fulcrum.
That's right.
Although none of it was choreographed or planned, and because that's sort of, I think, from what I understand, that was really a kind of a creative apex for him. And then the fact that it wasn't received as the classics that it really was. It took him a long time to kind of be able to play that and come to embrace Smile. And so I found out that we both sort of used that to connect to each other in some way.
Oh, that's amazing. The section of the film that's set in the mid-'80s is also very much about how a love story saves Brian's life. Let's take a little look at a clip from that. That's a very sweet scene that then when the appearance of Paul Giamatti in the car obviously takes another turn. Brian, how was Paul's performance as Dr. Landy? How does that track with your experience with him, who was so controlling?
He was casted so perfectly. Even his voice was a lot like Dr. Landy's voice. For a second there, I actually thought that was the real Dr. Landy in the film. Yeah.
Yeah. And that portion of your life, that began about 75 to about 85 or so, right?
Right.
Yeah, 85. And Melinda Ledbetter, Elizabeth Banks plays her in the film. You guys, what year did you get married, you and Melinda?
1995.
1995. So that love story in there, John, is very much a crucial part of the film. The sweetness, the vulnerability that I think we just mentioned a couple of minutes ago. In speaking with the Wilsons about it, what was a crux for you of how that relationship came to really kind of save Brian?
Well, I believe just from meeting them that Melinda saved his life in a way, because I think the doctor was kind of criminal in the way he was behaving. I think Brian, it seems to me that he for all the complexities of his family life and working with the Beach Boys and doing this revolutionary kind of music, that if you think about what he was doing with one ear, and he was influencing the Beatles across the Atlantic, and that was George Martin, Ringo Starr, George Harrison, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and they would write Rubber Soul, and then he would get his mind blown, and he would write God Only Knows, and this creativity kind of whipped back and forth across the Atlantic, and yet he never, I think, got as unconditionally accepted and loved as much as perhaps he found with Melinda. So I think it was a crucial thing in his life, and it seems very obvious to when you meet the Wilsons that they're meant to be together.
Yeah. And that line that's in the film, Brian, of that you're sitting around at the pool with your brothers and Mike Love, and you say, "We've got to one up these guys. You hear what they did on Rubber Soul, or we have to one up them, right?" That those kind of conversations that must have.
Well,
been
yeah, but we heard Rubber Soul,
yeah.
and as soon as I heard it, I said I got to write an album like that, you know. Yeah. So I wrote God Only Knows with my friend in about 45 minutes.
Yeah, and it. Do you know how long it took him to make Rubber Soul, or any?
No, I don't know.
Right?
More than 45 minutes.
More than 45 minutes.
And then you can hear, and then when you hear the Smile record that came out in the Smile sessions, and you understand that like Paul McCartney was there, and then you can hear Sgt. Pepper's in Smile, and you know, finally later when he was with Melinda and had gotten away from Dr. Landy, there was Paul McCartney in the front row at the Royal Albert Hall weeping.
Right.
You know, so they're very connected, these great pioneers of music, and so it's such an honor to play him, and Bill and everyone did, I think, a great job. We were all honored.
Yeah, Bill, there's a father-son connection in the film. Obviously, that's very oblique, but still there. It's there in brief scenes with Brian's father Murray, and how disapproving he was, and how he gets other bands. And then, of course, when Giamatti shows up as Dr. Landy, he's a surrogate father in a way, right? That's very much a relationship that it feels like in the film. Brian is searching for in a way, and takes a dark turn. Right?
Yeah, no, obviously, you want to present all your characters in a film. If you're going to present a story, you want all the characters to be well-rounded, and even people, clearly Dr. Landy was a controversial figure, and it's hard not to see just the dark side of it. But you'd also try to, fill it out and find the humanness in it, and I think Paul Giamatti did that remarkably well.
Yeah, and the scene with the hamburger, John, where he's essentially scolding him and then sort of kisses him. It's a denial of something, and then also, but I love you kind of thing. It's very conflicted and very complex.
It was very abusive, and this must have been what it was like. We were filming one day, and I was listening to the Smile sessions and trying to do some scene, and I got a text, "Brian's here," and we all went, "Whoa, my God!" And there was Brian and Al Jardine, and we all sort of were shocked, and then we said hello, and we went back into the scene. It was great, but it's strange to talk about the Wilsons with them right here. But But yeah, that was a very intense and dark period of his life. But what's great is that he got through it, and so that's the triumph of it.
Yeah, and our last clip does have a look at that triumph. Let's take a look at it right now. Brian, did that really happen? Was that
That actually happened? Yeah, we drove off the boat. That was in when was that?
Melinda?
87,
yeah.
Wow, metaphorically, and Bill, as an Oscar-winning producer, you know this better than I. That is jumping off into the deep end. That's two characters taking a leap and saving their lives and jumping off in the deep end, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, but it also speaks to a bigger dynamic of the film and the story. Is that Brian and Melinda had led very big lives, but honestly, a lot of the things that have happened to them, you wouldn't believe. And so when you're trying to tell a story, make a film about them, you're worried that people aren't going to believe it, that we just did this because it was the Hollywood way out or something.
Yeah.
Like the meeting in the Cadillac store,
or their reunion. I mean, they end up, Brian in the movie, Brian walks in front of Melinda's car, and that's how they reunite. and we're writing that, Oren and I are kind of working on the scene that's like, well, nobody's going to believe this. Nobody's going to believe that we didn't just make this up and,
Yeah.
you know, to ease it through it. But it all actually happened, so.
It's an extraordinary scene, and Melinda is looking through, Elizabeth Banks is looking kind of at the figure that's coming at her as the sun is glinting, and it's Brian kind of coming into focus. It's really remarkable, and the whole film is remarkable. We're going to take a couple of questions now from the audience over here on the left side. Yeah.
First of all, Brian, thank you for all the music. I listen to the Beach Boys every day. My question's about the movie. What are some of the favorite tracks you like to play? Also, on your tour this year, does it feel good to have Al Jardine and Blondie Chaplin back with you on stage?
Yeah, very much so. I appreciated what Al sang 1963 on Help Me Rhonda.
Yeah.
And Mike Love on Good Vibrations, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no. Mr. Cusack, what is some of the favorite tracks off a Smile that you like?
Everything off the Smile sessions, but you know, you can hear just the opening prayer, you know, kind of Our Prayer is just wild, and then Wind Chimes and You're Welcome. I mean, every piece of it is genius. So you can listen to the whole thing, and then you can listen to the demos and the layers on the Smile Sessions record, and some things that there's one thing called Tune X, and I don't even know what he had in mind for it because it never made the cut, but it's magical, and you can hear they're a real treasure. All of the music is.
I've fortunately gotten a chance to see the movie, which is a fantastic film. It's great.
Thank you.
And one of the things that really impressed me and impacted on me was the power music has when you get away from all the other distractions, that how the music affected your life, and obviously how you connected with it, you know, and you connected. Could you guys talk about, in making the film for the three of you, how you maybe reassessed or rethought things about music, maybe the music that's meant the most to you, or music that you guys discussed from the Beach Boys songs on?
Well, first of all, I was young and creative, you know, and back then I didn't really realize what I was really into. I was too young and naive to know what I was doing. And then later on in my life, when I saw this movie, I relived that experience, you know.
Well, I don't know if you want the broad or the specific, but I mean, you know, if you're asking about specific songs or music that came to appreciate more, for sure, during the process, you know, one song, for example, Surf's Up. I think, you know, we've all heard Surf's Up, kind of the version that came out on the album and all. But I guess I particularly connected with Brian's solo version of Surf's Up that was part of a documentary that he did back in the late 60s, just him on the piano. And we recreate that version in the movie, kind of a shot-by-shot recreation of that film. So that one, it really moves me a lot, you know, actually more so than the album version. But
I did a movie about people who love music, High Fidelity, and the thing that I remember most, it was set in England, but we set it in Chicago and took away the Cockney accents, and the only three things the greatest snobs in music could ever agree on was that Brian Wilson was on everybody's top 5 list. So, you know, to me, like a great piece of art or a great story or a great performance or a great piece of writing, a great song is you know, poets speak for us when we don't know how to express all of our feelings. And so it's pure fuel and inspiration, and they're North Stars, you know, the great poets and artists. So that's why it's an honor to do this.
also, I mean, I think for me too, I think that a lot of people appreciate Brian's music and the Beach Boys' music, but often a larger group tends to think of it as just surf music and kind of, oh, wasn't that fun, and all that stuff. And if you go back and look at that music, there was a lot more going on. It was much more complex, and the things he was doing in that kind of seemingly simple envelope was really amazing. And to have people start to appreciate the depth of his genius even back in those days.
And you also think about music that a certain time in your life, you know, I remember the first time I heard Pet Sounds, you know, in high school, and I remember the first time I heard The Clash, and I remember, you know, all those things, and it helps define who you are autobiographically, and you experience your life through art. And then as you change, the art's still there, and then you kind of revisit it again, and you've moved on a bit. So it's a tough question, but a good one.
I always love how a great film, if you go to it at different times, is exactly what you're saying, John. You go to it at different times in your life, you may associate with different characters, you may see different philosophies in it. And I think a great song is like that too. God Only Knows being a perfect example of it. We all heard it probably when we were 14, 15. When you start to really listen to it, at a certain point, as Murray Wilson says, it's a musical suicide note. But it's not even that. There's so many more levels going on to just that one song, not to mention so many others.
And when you're doing something new, it can't always, it's very rare. I mean, it's really nice that everybody's loving this movie right now when it comes out. But when you're really innovative, it's not a slam dunk that everybody's going to appreciate the genius right now in real time. Sometimes it takes a while. And Brian was so successful that I think the Pet Sounds and the Smile record, it just took a while for the world to catch up to how brilliant this creation was. And it just speaks to the creative process and this sort of instant gratification culture we have, maybe a little bit, that you got to let art breathe.
I owe that a little bit to my collaborator, Van Dyke Parks, who was a genius lyricist and a great music guy. And together we created a very special kind of a music thing. Yeah.
Hi guys. First of all, Brian, thanks for the beautiful music. It's still inspiring people today. And it's great to hear you guys mention Smile, which is probably my favorite record ever.
Mine too.
Yeah. John, it was great to hear you mention that was inspiring for you. I wondered if you could just tell us real quick, I know obviously Pet Sounds is a big focus of the movie, but how much of Van Dyke and the Smile sessions do we get to see? And maybe if you could each tell us which track on Smile was the most inspiring to you.
Well, you do see a lot of this. You do see a lot of Smile and Pet Sound sessions, right? I mean.
Yeah, I mean, again, we were facing a lot of decisions here of trying to tell a story, and hopefully a very intimate story about Brian and Melinda. And we had to make some hard choices. Honestly, we shot a bunch of stuff during the Smile sessions. Ultimately, whether you're happy or not, some of it's not all on. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
You do see Brian performing Love and Mercy at the end, too. Yeah.
Hi, Brian. Your creativity has made quite an impact in the world, and from what I'm hearing, it seems that maybe you weren't able to appreciate yourself as much as everyone around you was appreciating you. And I'm wondering if this movie and the amazing people you worked with has given you an opportunity to really love yourself more, to really...
Yeah, watching the movie went two different ways. One, I was excited, and another one, I was totally depressed, And through it all, my depression didn't stop me from producing.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, thanks for the music, including the stuff that came before and after Pet Sounds and Smile. I just wanted to know, was there anything in your life that you wish showed up in the movie but had to be cut or just wasn't written into it?
Well, of course, I always answer these questions like the worst part of my life was taking drugs that weren't as good for my mind, and that was tough for me to go through. But it didn't stop me from producing, the Smile sessions and the Pet Sounds,
Awesome. Okay, so first of all, this movie is just so amazing because it's not only just a movie about music, but there's just so many different levels of complexity. That's what I found so extraordinary about this. So what my question is, besides hanging out with the Wilsons, how else did you prepare for this part, to really get a feel for the beautiful complexity of Brian Wilson's soul? There had to be even more to it to really get a full picture.
Well, I mean, I think the way I went into it was the music. And when I was listening to the sessions and the Smile sessions, you can hear him interacting with his friends. You can hear him joking around and doing comedy with Hal Blaine, and you get a portrait of who he was. And then when he was going through his dark period, you know, you had to mask that a little bit, and then it came out again when he met Melinda. So I always went back to the music, and it's all there in the music. You know, so many complex emotions and the depth of emotion, and then I think, you know, it's people mistake kindness for weakness sometimes, but you know, it takes a lot of courage to like live with a really open heart. And so the music and him and his story sort of challenge you to open yourself up and really be vulnerable. And so I don't know how Paul did it or I did it. I'm happy that they're happy.
And this movie, you walk out of the film really with a smile on your face. I mean, that sounds like a cliche, but it is really true. It has an extraordinary final shot, final moment. That is really wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, it is Love and Mercy. It opens tomorrow. Go and see it. The legendary Brian Wilson, Bill Pohlad, John Cusack.